And here we are, a look at an absolutely earth-changing event, the Russian Revolution. There are actually two Russian revolutions in 1917, but the one with the lasting impact is certainly the one in November, the Bolshevik or Communist Revolution, the creation of a Marxist communist state in Russia, which became the Soviet Union. Reminder about Russia, it is far behind the rest of Western Europe. Now, Russia is both Asian and European. The majority of the land is certainly in the Asian continent, which is divided by the Ural Mountains. On the other hand, the majority of the population and the leadership, the government centers of Moscow and sometimes St. Petersburg, excuse me, are all in the European part of it. Serfdom, which is, the old feudal system of people tied to the land, not able to leave, can be sold with the land, etc., a form basically of slavery with some distinctions, didn't actually disappear in Russia until 1861. Of course, remember that slavery was legal in the United States till 1865. England, France, etc., had abolished slavery in the 1830s. And feudalism, just as an economic system, really had started to disappear from Western Europe a few centuries earlier, although still kind of lingered on in some ways. Three czars worth noting in this period. Alexander II, he was the so-called reformer czar. He's the one that abolished serfdom. He is actually assassinated by people to the more radical left, people that want to see the elimination of the czar as a system and a new different Russia, entirely different. His son, Alexander III, says, well, you killed my father who tried to reform. I will crack down. I will be all powerful, etc. He dies in 1894, and Tsar Nicholas II takes over. You see him on the right. And Tsar Nicholas II, in retrospect, but even at the time, was kind of the Louis XVI equivalent, Louis XVI of France. Um, Probably a reasonable enough, capable enough guy in an impossible situation and no real ability to rule in ways that were necessary for the crisis that Russia was ending. You can take a look at all these specific numbers, but yeah, 375% illiteracy, per capita income tiny. Remember that it's the Russian Empire. It's not just Russia, but it's all the areas in the Central Asian, Central European sections, Ukrainians and Belarusians and Armenians and Georgians and etc. Well, it's thought to be about 200 nationalities and about 150 different languages spoken. Major changes, to be sure. Um, only about 2.4% million. I don't know if that's 2.4 million or 2.4%. That would be a typo on my behalf. But the bottom line, for the most part, people, it's still a very, very agricultural society. Yes, Russia has made some changes in the previous, say, 20 years or so to modernize, industrialize, but far behind the West. We talked about the Russo-Japanese War numerous times. Japan becomes a world power. It becomes an example for everybody else, for the other colonized people of the world, for Asians and Africans. These Europeans can be beaten. Hugely important, to be sure. But two other things that are important. Number one, because Russia loses in Asia, it starts to turn its political and military focus on the Balkan regions, the Slavic regions, Serbia, Bosnia. Is that ringing a bell? That's, of course, where Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. Russia has a deeper interest in that part of the world, and hence, when they feel threatened by Austria Hungary and Germany, it's World War One, guys. World War One maybe doesn't happen without this war. And the other thing is that the Tsar is deeply weakened. A major revolt turns out in 1905 in Russia, and it comes close to toppling Tsar Nicholas then. Remember that this is the last absolute monarch of Europe. Tsar Nicholas is the head of the state, head of government. He's the head of the army. He is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, he doesn't have the personal qualities or ability to control all, obviously, but in theory, he is an all powerful, sort of chosen by God monarch. Things are bad for the Russian people, increasingly bad, and losses in the war with Japan, of course, are not helping matters. Like with Louis XVI in France, the peasants don't hate Tsar Nicholas for the most part, because they don't ever see the Tsar. They have this idea of this mythical father figure that would protect his people, care for his people, if only he knew the horrors they were suffering, the hunger, the indignity, the abuse. Who they hate, of course, are the nobles, the people that own the land that they are forced practically by law to stay on. Now, technically, serfdom did disappear, but the reality is that the serfs were illiterate. They couldn't, the former serfs, they couldn't read and write. They had no basic skills. They had no uh, uh, economic resources at all. They were very, very badly treated for the most part by the nobles. So you see a whole army of peasants that are gathering in Moscow, or St. Petersburg, I think it was. It is St. Petersburg. And they have a petition to Tsar Nicholas and basically says, oh, dear, dear father of all Russian people, if you only knew how these horrible nobles are treating us, please protect us, give us bread, give us land. We know we can count on you. And the military comes out, opens fire, and possibly kills as many as 1,000 people. This is called Bloody Sunday, January of 1905. Now, Tsar Nicholas was unaware that they were there. He didn't give the orders to open fire, but it is his regime that does this, and this very much weakens his support among the peasants and also among that Western educated, Western leading bourgeoisie that are tired of living in a backwards Russia. So Tsar Nicholas has to compromise. He issues what he calls the October Manifesto, the October Statement. And look, with the revolution going on, with the loss in Japan, he's trying to hold on. He compromises with these moderate liberals, the people that would have fit in pretty well in 19th century France or 19th century England, freedom of speech and, a parliamentary democracy to some degree. And he promises, he says, look, we're going to have to compromise. We're going to set up a Duma, a legislature, a parliament, a Congress, and they will meet. We're going to have a written constitution so that there are things that are allowed and not allowed to do for people and government, and civil liberties like those basic freedoms of speech and religion and assembly and the press, they will be guaranteed. Not so surprisingly, within a year, the Duma does meet and the Duma is dissolved by the Tsar. And all of these promises of basic rights and liberties, not much happens with this. But the edge is taken off the revolution, off the rebellion, and Nicholas continues to be Tsar. Hemophilia. It's the inability of the blood to clot. So technically, if you're a hemophiliac, you have a slight cut, it bleeds a little, and it keeps bleeding, keeps bleeding. Hemophiliacs often don't live all that long. You will notice up here, there is a female carrier whose name Victoria, Queen of England. Yes, that's the Queen Victoria, the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901. She is the one who rules over England, at least as the figurehead monarch, but she did have some power. You will notice that she was not hemophiliac, but she passed it on to various family members as a carrier, including this family here, which becomes the royal family of Russia. Here's Tsar Nicholas with his wife Alexandra, who is a carrier for this virus. Among the 5 children of Tsar Nicholas, remember that all the royal families, they're intermarried. If my son's a prince, he's going to marry a princess. There aren't a lot of princesses out there. But wait, Ziegler, won't that lead to inbreeding? Yes, it does lead to inbreeding. And here's an example. Hemophilia is endemic throughout the royal families of Europe. And of the 5 children of the Tsar and Tsarina, we have Alexei. Alexei is the Tsarevich. He will be the next Tsar of Russia. He is hemophiliac, and he is nearly always on death's door. Here he is with I guess that would be the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, and there is our future Tsar, Alexei. Ah, look at the eyes, Rasputin. You'll notice that I say question mark 1870. We don't know when he was born, but it was about then. He definitely died in 1916. So he is a peasant, a mystic, touched by God, as it were, who shows up one day at the royal palace and said, God has sent me to heal the Tsarevich. I know that Tsarevich sounds like an insult. It's not. Tsarevich simply means prince. Tsar, Tsarevich. So it's not a bad word, even though it sounds like that. You would think ordinarily you would just turn the guy away and call the guards if he doesn't leave voluntarily, but of course, people are religious, they are superstitious, probably more so in Russia, which is a slightly less developed country. Well, you know what? The guards bring him in, they get word to the Tsarina, and she says, I am so desperate to save my son's life. Yes, of course, let's see him. And Rasputin comes into the room and he lays hands upon the Tsarevich, who is lying perhaps on his deathbed, and he issues some chants and he goes into a trance, and the Tsarevich recovers. This man is touched by God, and God has made him a healer. And he becomes a huge part of the Russian government and the royal social family. You see this cartoon on the bottom right. You see Rasputin. By the way, prom date question. Do you want to go to the prom with him? You probably don't. Hence, that's not a good guy. Who's sitting in his lap like little children? It's the Tsar and the Tsarina, looking foolish and childlike. In other words, Rasputin is controlling them. You see a photograph here of Rasputin in the middle. There are a couple of men in that photograph, but there are a lot more women. There are stories, ones that if I were to tell you, I would be fired instantly. But apparently, Rasputin had tremendous powers of persuasion, and I will stop with that. But there are stories, you can look them up online. To the degree this is true is not really known, but there is a widespread belief that Rasputin is basically controlling the government. Now, once the war breaks out, the Tsar has gone off the front to ineptly lead the Russian military. This leaves the Tsarina behind very much under the influence of Rasputin. And Rasputin has a lot of power over policies, over who is going to be in government, etc. And finally, you notice that exclamation point with 1916 dead. A couple of army officers decide to save Russia. This man must die. And so they go over to his place, they bring some cakes and coffee, and the cakes are loaded up with a poison that would kill 20 horses. And Rasputin, the man of great appetite, eats cake after cake after cake, and it doesn't affect him. So they pull out a revolver, a gun, and they shoot him repeatedly, and he keeps coming after them. So they finally take like clubs and start stabbing him and pounding on him, and he finally collapses. And so they put him into a bag, his dead body into a bag to take him to dump him in the river. And on the way there, he begins to come to and fight back, and they have to continue beating and stabbing at him. And they finally get him to the river. They throw him into the icy river, and the story is at least he clawed his way out of the bag and a hand came up out of the water before they stood there with clubs and beat him down and finally sent him to his grave. This might be embellished, is my guess. It probably wasn't quite this dramatic, but it certainly leads the myth of the beast who would not die. Fascinating figure, though, Rasputin, and says a lot about Russia that he would have had so much power at the time. Again, don't look into the stories, it will warp your mind, curve your spine, and lose the war for the Allies. So don't look into that. Got to remember Karl Marx, and he becomes important again. A couple things worth pointing out. Born in 1818, starts writing in the 1840s. And that's a fairly important thing that he was born then, because industrialization had started in England to a degree, in the German states and Belgium, etc. But most economic historians would argue up until about 1850, the horrors of industrialization, the tenements and the cramps and the dangerous working conditions, were probably of more impact than the benefits that industrialization in terms of access to better goods and better food supplies, etc. 1850 is kind of that tipping point a little bit where you can start to argue that maybe industrialization benefits the working class more than it hurts them. Since Marx is starting his writing before then, some have argued that he was trapped in this line of thinking that, oh, industrialization is this terrible thing and the working class is completely exploited. They were exploited, there's no question. Hypothetically, if he'd been born in 1840, might he have had a different interpretation? And 1883 is quite significantly the year before the Berlin Conference. In other words, Marx did not live to see imperialism, and that's fairly important. Now, Marx's argument is that class struggle, the constant battle between those few who have and those many who have none, is what drives history. So the weaker cavemen banded up to attack and kill the powerful caveman, and the old caveman system was destroyed. I don't think there was a caveman system, but you get the idea. Cutting ahead to Europe in the so called Middle Ages, the feudal system. Yeah, you've got the few landowners, the nobles, whose goal is to get more land and more for them. And then you've got the 98% of the population of peasant serfs whose goal for themselves is to get more for themselves. So that leads to an inevitable conflict, Marx says, and finally it hits ahead, and after hundreds of years of struggle, the two opposing forces collide, and there's a major disruption in society, and a new society comes out of the ashes. And this, for Marx, is industrial capitalism. And once again, we have the bourgeoisie, the owners, the bankers, and the landlords, and the factory owners, the very, very few. And then he sees the oppressed many as the proletariat, the urban worker. And again, their goals are entirely contradictory. The bourgeoisie wants more for them, the workers want their own part and their own control. And Marx says this will happen much more quickly because history speeds up over time. There will be a giant clash between the two. Yes, it'll probably be bloody and violent. Marx would have argued, he wrote a lot about the French Revolution, that although the French Revolution was not industrial capitalism leading to a crisis, it's a similar dynamic. So we will see a clash between the two. And here's the thing, it's not that Marx said, maybe this will happen, and I sure hope the working class wins. No, Marx said this is science. This is what will happen. It's inevitable. This clash is coming, and the working class will win. That is what will happen. Um, Newton did not say, you know what, if I drop this pen on the ground, I really, really hope that it falls to the ground and doesn't float in the air. And, if we play our cards right, the pen will drop to the floor. Otherwise, it might float in the air. Marx saw his social science as every bit as scientific, and many Marxists have looked at it as well, too. What about after this revolution that will happen? Marx didn't talk a lot about it. Marx probably recognized, as most of us did, that, we're not that good at predicting the future. He was confident that would happen based on his analysis of history and what had repeated itself over the years. What exactly will this new communist society look like? He didn't spend a lot of time on that. He did recognize, and again, probably looking back at the French Revolution, remember Robespierre said the purpose of government is to be trusting of the people and earn their trust and hold itself accountable, to be honest, to be true. And that's great in a perfect world. But right now we have a crisis. We have a revolution. The revolution's being attacked by enemies outside and inside. And so we have to adjust and use harsher methods. We have to use terror along with the virtue. And Marx appears to have understood this. He referred to the term a dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, the revolution happens tomorrow. There are still a lot of old army folks and representatives of the Tsar, the royal family, and the bourgeoisie, and the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Catholic Church, or any religious church, because he's not talking specifically about Russia by any means. Well, these people have a lot of power and influence, and they will probably have to be controlled by the working class. For how long? We don't know. Marx was not that clear. He did hint that eventually, once we stop competing, once our souls have been saved by a new equal world, at that point, we're not really going to even need government. The government will just wither away and we live in a cooperative sense of utopia. Pretty hopeful. Not totally crazy, but pretty overly hopeful. Socialist movement, Russia has a strong and powerful radical movement. Remember, there was the group that assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1884. They were called the Black Hand. And there are multiple competing radical groups in Russia. People that had, generally the more educated middle class, folks that had read, etc. There is a official socialist or communist party. Again, socialism and communism in 1900 in Marx's time mean kind of the same thing. Fairly after, and this is something you'll do next week, you're going to see a distinction between what we mean by socialism and communism. They're very different things today. There is a split. there are two groups, and here's what the main argument is. One group says, look, we are believers in Marx's idea. And there are a lot of people out there, a lot of politicians, a lot of political groups. They're not Marxists, but they want to see a better life for working people. And they want to see the end to the czar's control. And they want to see working conditions. They want to see things better for people with more focus on poorer people. Eventually, we might have a Marxist type revolution, but we need to work with people with whom we share a lot of ideas. That was what became known as the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks, headed by Vladimir Lenin, said, absolutely not. We do exactly what Marx says, and we do not compromise. And the moment we start negotiating with non Marxists, we're destroying the revolution. Lenin was a very clever politician. When this split happened in 1903, he announced, we, the absolute Marxists, are the Bolsheviks, and in Russian that means we are the majority. Those other traitors, cowards, they are the Mensheviks, the minority. Actually, there were a lot more Mensheviks than Bolsheviks. But the power to say, whose side are you on? Well, I'm with the majority, even though they were a fairly small minority, is powerful. Again, Bolshevik ideas, orthodox Marxism. There's no compromise. There's no opportunism. There's no, you know what, let's run for a seat in the Duma and we can institute some changes. No, we're following the Marxist pattern. Marx had talked about how the working class will naturally form a class consciousness. They will recognize what they have in common with each other and who the common enemy is. Lenin says, you know, that would be ideal, but what we're going to need first is a small number of top secret elite vanguards. Vanguard simply means the leaders. And these will be the educated Marxists who know what Marx had to say, and they will jumpstart the revolution, and then the working class will follow along. And by the way, because we are orthodox Marxists and we are the leaders, you have to agree with us. There is a strong centralized party. If at any point anybody starts to argue or disagree, those people will be purged. Now, what does purging mean? Uh-oh, I just ate 2 pounds of salmon mousse. I feel like I'm feeling kind of food poison. I'd better put my finger down my throat and to get it out of my system. Yes, sound effects in this video lecture. Fantastic. Well, that's what purging is. You don't agree with what the elite vanguard, what Lenin and the other leaders have said, you're out of the party. We are purging you. Now, by the time Lenin and Stalin take power, the purging involves a lot more than kicking out of the party. The Bolsheviks, pretty much all the leadership has to leave. It's a dangerous place to be in Russia. The Tsar's people are after them, and they are living in various parts of Europe after 1900. So here is Lenin, intense eyes, and his fundamental question. His real name, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, but took the name Lenin as his nom de guerre, his war name, his revolutionary name. I'll let you just take a couple minutes to read these on your own, but these are excerpts from a pamphlet that he wrote from exile, from Switzerland, I believe. This is the plan for the Bolsheviks. And the question is, what is to be done? How do we make history? How do we take control? And if you'll take a couple of minutes to read these over and see if you can understand numbers 1 and 2, what's he saying in 3, 4, 5. Hint, in the next few slides, you're going to see pretty much everything that he wrote represented as well. But take a read through and just see if you can understand the language first. This, by the way, is quite a story. There is a theory called 6 degrees of separation, that any two people on the planet are connected to each other with no more than 6 steps in between them. I know Alfredo. Alfredo knows Henrietta. Henrietta once met Barack Obama at some kind of a public ceremony. Barack Obama has met Pope Francis II. Pope Francis II knows Vladimir Putin of Russia. Hey, look at this. Alfredo and Vladimir Putin are separated by only 5 steps. Dr. Warren Lerner, you see in the first, one of my professors at Duke many, many years ago, since gone on, since died. He was an older man at this point. But check out this story. Another story, this one from Dr. Lerner of Duke University, who I knew. During the last half of the war, this is 1914, 15, 16, Lenin lived in a small town in Switzerland where he went to the small town library almost every day to read the papers and write his letters. It was from this town they go on to explain how he was sent back to Russia by the Germans in 1917. We'll get there in a moment. When the great historian E. H. Carr, who Dr. Lerner knew, by the way, and I knew Dr. Lerner, was doing his research for one of his books on Russian history, he went to the town of Zimmerwald, went to the library, and asked if anybody had been working in the library during the war. An older man came forward, so E. H. Carr knows this man who knew Dr. Lerner, who knows me. And Carr asked him, "Do you remember Lenin coming to use this library every day?" Well, the man scratched his head and he said he knew nothing of a man called Lenin. Carr took him over to the small table near the big window that Lenin had described in his correspondence as his favorite writing table. While the man took one look, he brightened and said, "Ah, you must mean Herr Ulyanov, a short, bald man. Small round glasses?" Oh, he had an intense glare, but he was a very nice man. I never heard of him after he left Zimmerwald. Of course, that short man with the bald head and round glasses was Lenin, and this man was unaware that Herr Ulyanov, who he did know, who was very nice to him, in fact was Lenin, the man who took over Russia and changed history. Lenin talked to the librarian, who talked to E. H. Carr, who knew Dr. Lerner, who knew me, and you know me as well. You are all connected to Vladimir Lenin by 6 degrees of separation, even though he's been dead for almost a century. Somebody want to sing It's a Small World After All? Why not? Love that story. So Lenin's background, not a peasant, educated background, middle class, went to university, etc. His brother had been one of the many involved in the radical movements. He was involved in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. It was uncovered, he was captured, he was executed, and many argue that Lenin was paying back his brother's death on the Tsar. Possibility. He was sent off. He himself, as a radical, was arrested, sent to Siberia, these god awful gulags, 40 degrees below. He managed to survive. There's actually an amnesty given by the Tsar to people who are political prisoners as long as he left the country. So he went off to Western Europe for about 20 years. Again, he becomes the leadership of and the namer of the Bolshevik communists. And remember, strict party discipline, we speak with one voice. There's a small number of us who know scientific Marxism, and we will be the ones to lead the revolution, and absolutely no compromise. You don't find people who agree with you on about 2/3 of the issue and find common ground, because again, Marx is not a set of possible ideas. Marx is science. And you see this quote here. Lenin says, "From the philosophy of Marxism, cast of one piece of steel, it is impossible to expunge or pull off a single basic premise, a single essential part, without deviating from objective truth, without falling into the arms of bourgeois reactionary falsehood." In other words, if I have a chunk of steel, I have a bowling ball in front of you, and you say, I like this part of the bowling ball, but not the others. So let me just grab this little part of the bowling ball and I'll take that and leave. Well, you can't do this. It is a solid piece of marble or steel. You accept the whole thing or you accept nothing. And keep in mind, Marx's ideas are not ideas. They are the objective scientific truth. You can't say, oh, gravity works with pens, but it doesn't work with guitars. Well, no, of course not. It is the scientific law of gravity. It is the scientific law of Marx's findings. That is the belief behind this. He's more clear than Marx that yes, we need, when the revolution happens, to have a dictatorship to control the society. But whereas the Tsar was a dictatorship, that was a dictatorship that benefited the Tsar. It was a selfish dictatorship. We will create this dictatorship to create a far better world for 98% of the population. In March of 1917, by the way, it's a little confusing because the Russians were using the older Julian calendar, which meant that in Russia it was technically February, but it's known in the West as the March Revolution. The Tsar was already weak. The war with Japan, the failed revolution in 1905, and the Russians are just getting clobbered in the war. I mean, massive numbers, people going hungry in the cities. It's a disaster. There are organizations called Soviets, and you might recognize that from Soviet Union. Yep, that's where the term comes from. What they are is workers' councils. They are workers that are inspired by these revolutionary ideas to come together and take control. And they ultimately say, you know what? We are no longer standing behind the Tsar, and the Tsar, who is terribly unpopular at this point, is finally forced to stand down. The Romanov dynasty, which took over in 1603, is no more. The Tsar and his family are arrested and taken off to a country area, and we are setting up a new government in Russia. This is again in the middle of World War I. Always love this. It has come to pass, says the caption. There is the peasant soldier. What's there to his left, to his right, to our left? It's a throne. Who's sitting in the throne? Nobody. And you can see this ghostly presence kind of floating off. The Tsar is gone. The absolute monarchy is no more. Well, we have no more Tsar. We need to set up a new government, fellow Russians. It's called the Provisional or Temporary Government. The mere fact that it's led by a man whose name is Prince Lvov, Prince is not his first name, he is a member of the royal family, probably tells you this is not a communist government, a Bolshevik radical government. You know what? It's pretty moderate. It's pretty looking toward Western Europe and the United States. You know, the finer, better people of society run things, but we try to open up, voting and certain rights to people, etc. There is a single socialist, and he's a Menshevik, Alexander Kerensky, you see in the bottom. And you know what? They start some liberal reforms, freedom of the press, especially economic freedoms, where people are able to buy and sell without the government's permission, etc. I will tell you that those on the political right, the czar's people, the military, the nobles, they're horrified by this. You've overthrown God's representative. We are your enemy. But also from the left, the socialists, the Bolsheviks, etc., that don't see this as a real change. Here's the key decision they make. Russians are sick of this war. It has destroyed not only Russian soldiers by the millions, but civilians who are going hungry. Russia probably suffers worse than any country in this stupid war. But the provisional government decides Russia's lost too much territory in this war. It would not be honorable to surrender. Tell you what we'll do. We'll launch one massive offensive at the Germans and take back this Russian land, and then we will create a peace. Well, the offensive fails, and Russians are just slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands. And this leads to peasant revolts, and the Soviets in the big cities, the workers start to revolt. In a desperate attempt to satisfy them, the socialist in the cabinet, Alexander Kerensky, is named president in July of 1917. We've seen this story already. I don't know why it's there twice. Meanwhile, Lenin is in Zimmerwald, right? Talking to the person that you are separated from by 5 degrees of separation. The Germans decide to contact Lenin. Mr. Lenin, do you want to go back to Russia? Yes, but I can't get in. We can get you in. We'll put you in a heavily armored train, take you from Switzerland north through Finland into Russia, and we will drop you off in St. Petersburg. Now, why in the world would the Germans want Lenin back in Russia? Is it because the Germans, the Kaiser, they're all a bunch of communists? No, it is not that at all. They are hoping that Lenin will come in because things are so fluid in Russia, because there is this new revolution. He will come in and mess up. He will stir things up. He will create chaos, which would benefit Germany because the Germans are desperate by this point. That is the very same month that the United States has declared war on Germany. And the Germans know when the Americans come to fight, and with the effects of the blockade, they're in trouble. Maybe Lenin can mobilize people, create chaos in Russia, weaken Russia, pull them out of the war. Quickly, when he comes back, he mobilizes people, and the Petrograd Soviet. Petrograd is today's St. Petersburg. That is the key workers' organization in the state. You would see this, for example, in Bolivia, where like the miners' unions who can have real power from time to time, that kind of thing. So it's not just a group that gets together and fights for better wages. They're real political forces. The Bolsheviks gain control. The Petrograd Soviet is a pro Bolshevik Marxist organization. What do the Bolsheviks call for? You know what? We can read all of these things, but the bottom line is we offer peace, land, and bread. That's a very simple slogan, but think how appealing that is to, oh, I don't know, about 98% of Russians destroyed by 3 years of war, landless and desperate because the nobles have it all, and the people in the cities, they want to eat. That's what the Bolsheviks promise, and it's a very effective slogan. So we have then a second revolution in 1917. It's actually, again, according to the Russian calendar, it's in October, but it's November by our calendar and the one that is more commonly used today. That Russian offensive, that military offensive on the Germans, it fails miserably, and the provisional government is so weak. Well, on November 7th, our calendar, Bolsheviks take control of the telephones, the power plants, the railways. There's also a major naval mutiny, so the Navy has turned against the provisional government. Lenin announces, I am in control. This is a new Russian state run by the Bolsheviks. He holds elections in January, and the Bolsheviks don't win. And Lenin pretty much and quite openly ignores these. He says, look, to hand over the power to the assembly, chosen by ignorant people, would be compromising with the malignant bourgeoisie. And you know what? Generally speaking, in communism, the value of elections is pretty limited, guys. The idea is that you know what people don't know what they're voting for. They're told by the church, go vote for this party, for this candidate. You know who really knows how to create this just and mighty revolution? Why it's that vanguard and leaving it in the hands of millions of voters who are just they're superstitious, they're uninformed. We're going to ignore this. Yes, we're creating a dictatorship of and for the proletariat. Russians have got to get out of the war. Germany and Russia agree to a war that would end. And you know what? The Bolsheviks give up a ton. You see all this area that's kind of shaded in the Ukraine, etc. That used to be part of the Russian Empire, handed over to Germany. Why, oh, why, in January of 1918, why would Lenin agree to a treaty in which Russia loses so much? Well, there are three reasons. One, remember that communism is an internationalist organization. Lenin does not see himself as a leader of the Russian people. He sees himself as a leader of the working class. And you know what? Lenin was right about this. He saw this entire war as just being capitalist and imperialist, basically rich people with guns and weapons who wanted more, more, more. This king wanted this territory, that king wanted that parliament, wanted that colony, etc. And basically just sending young people, young working people to die. So he was morally opposed to the war to begin with, and that goes back well before the war began. Secondly, he knew what happened to the provisional government. They didn't end the war, and it cost them any hope of support. So politically, he's got to get Russia out of this war. And thirdly, remember how Lenin looks at Marxism. It's not something that might happen some places. It's inevitable. It's the future. So you know what? In the next few years or few decades at most, right now, this land remains in capitalist, imperialist German hands. Don't worry. The workers will revolt and overthrow that system, and eventually everything on this map will be a communist-led system. He has much confidence in that. So the royal family, what to do with them? They are held outside of Moscow, outside of St. Petersburg, actually. There's sort of two capitals in Russia. It's sort of confusing, but I'll sort of use them interchangeably. And here's the concern. Because there is a civil war that breaks out in Russia between the communists and the anti-communists, we'll come back to that in a second. The decision is made in July of 1918 that the royal family must die. Because as long as they're there, they are a source of resistance. People will hope to return the Tsar. And in July of 1918, they are brought from their cabin down into the basement. Men come in with machine guns, open up fire, fill the room with smoke, and they are all killed. Now, you might notice in the bottom, you see that little girl with an A on her. That is Anastasia. And there is a long-standing myth that Anastasia escaped, that she managed to survive. And as late as the 1950s and 60s, you would periodically read about a little old woman with a thick Russian accent showing up in London, calling a newspaper and saying, "I am Anastasia. I survived that day long ago." It's understood. The bones have been found, DNA tests have been done. The entire family was wiped out on that day. So Anastasia, as neat as that sounds, was not saved during this. So they are all executed. I mentioned a civil war. Almost immediately, the Red Bolsheviks, red is the color of communism, the new government of Russia, end up in a civil war with the White Army, red versus white. Now, these are largely monarchists, old military people, but they also include people who are small d Democrats. In other words, I mean people that believe in a Western style government, Montesquieu and the split levels of government and the natural rights and freedom of speech and freedom of property, protection of property, etc. And also socialists, people who are heavily influenced by Marx, who just say, man, these Bolsheviks, these folks are dangerous. Kerensky would have been part of this. Something I didn't mention on here, or didn't put on the slide, is that Western countries, the United States in particular, become involved in this civil war. Up until 1919, notice this is after World War I ends, there is still a battalion of American soldiers that are in Russia. Now they say, oh, we're looking for some Czech soldiers who have been lost. In fact, they are involved in helping the whites overthrow the Bolsheviks. To be honest with you, they don't play a major role. They're not that impactful. But absolutely, this new government has the United States Army in some ways working against them, fighting against them in their country. And of course, the Russian communists remember this. When we were trying to solidify our revolution, you were working against us. And so you can see the hostility growing between both sides. These are estimates, but the belief is that maybe 7, 8, 9 million Russians died in those 4 years of civil war, more than half of them by famine. The food supplies stopped. By 1922, when finally the Russian Red Army defeats the whites and takes control over the country, you know what? The Russians had suffered 10 million dead and probably 2 to 3 times that many injured or crippled or whatever else. Factory output, already the lowest in Europe, but drops by 80%. Iron, which you need to modernize, drops by 98%. And agricultural, this is an agricultural society, about 2/3 of the production is gone by 1922. So one would assume that this government of a small number of people with a society that's been destroyed like this, it couldn't possibly last. And why this? Oh, this is Civil War stuff. Yeah, I don't need that as much. Quick look toward Joseph Stalin. Lenin dies in 1924. In retrospect, I would have put one slide ahead of this, but we'll come back to it. I think it's coming in a couple. Joseph Stalin Lenin dies in 1924, and there is a power struggle. It's not clear who is going to take over. There is no vice president, there are no elections, etc. Joseph Stalin, who is thought by most not to be favored by Lenin. Lenin was very skeptical of Stalin. But manages to maneuver himself to power and becomes the absolute dictator of Russia for the next 27 years. Notice the official painting of proud Papa Joe, father of his people, and the beautiful, adoring children in nature bringing him flowers. Quite inspiring, isn't it? By the way, the USSR is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. Yes, it includes Russia, and that's the dominant part with Moscow and St. Petersburg and all of this, or it becomes known as Leningrad eventually, by the way, but that it also includes all these other nationalities, these dozens or even hundreds of nationalities that don't see themselves as Russian, but they've been taken into the Russian state and they become Soviets as well. They become separate but controlled republics within. So technically speaking, as of 1924, it's not Russia, it's the Soviet Union, but it's fine just to say Russia. Lenin, by the way, remember how Lenin said, you do not compromise, you follow Marx's program? Lenin wasn't a dumb guy. And Lenin recognized in 1921, after 3 years of war and 3 years of civil war, look, this is a disaster. We're going to have to make some compromises. He introduces what he calls the new economic plan. And you know what? It's not pure communism. He allows some private ownership. The kulaks, which are basically wealthy peasants, they're peasants that own land. You know what? You guys, if you produce the food and turn it over to the state, if there's some left over, you can sell it. So he is allowing some private property, some wealth, etc. And he does this because he needs to encourage production. And you know what? The economic bleeding, the starvation, it helps to recover. So Lenin is, when in power, compromising, which I think speaks well of him. Well, he dies in 1924, and Stalin manages to take power by 1926. You see his chilling statement, when we hang the capitalists, they will sell us the rope that we use. See in his political cartoon, that is Lenin sweeping, cleaning up royalty, capitalists, church members, etc., cleaning out the old to create a new society. Stalin abandons the NEP, the New Economic Policy. Starting in 1928, he says, no, we are going to organize society with a central government in the capital of Moscow, and we are going to create a new socialist society. Now, it's taken the West 200 years to industrialize. We're going to do it in 5, 10, 15, or 20. You notice those are 5-year intervals because Stalin announces the first of a series of 5-year plans. And this sets up specific targets. We are going to go from 8,000 tons of steel. 5 years from now, we're going to make 147,000 tons of steel. In other words, here are the numbers. Government makes the decision about how much to produce. The goal is industrialization, steel, factories, mass production. But how do we do this? Because most Russians are farmers. We will collectivize the agriculture. And this makes some sense because most Russians that have any land own a little tiny piece of land. Well, they can't afford the new technology. You can't ask a peasant farmer, hey, why don't you buy a tractor? I don't have any money at all. But if you take tens of thousands of small landowners, put the state in charge, and the state provides them with 3 tractors, they can massively increase production. And then, because fewer people are producing food, but more food is being produced, people can flood into the cities and start working in these new factories. And you know what? It works, guys. It works. The rate of industrial growth is off the charts, absolutely. And the Soviets become, by the 1930s, a major industrial and military power. And fascinating, when the United States and Western Europe is mired in the Great Depression of 33, 34, 35, 36, Russia is not experiencing this. Russia is showing growth in the economy, more production, more steel production. The communist system doesn't have a problem with unemployment. And you'd better believe there are people throughout the United States and England and France and Germany that are looking toward Russia as maybe that's the alternative. I don't want to make this sound too good. There is an absolutely horrific famine, especially hitting the Ukraine, and it's pretty intentional. Kills literally millions of people, and horrific human rights abuses, which we'll cover in just a moment. Again, on the plus side, and by the way, the controlled media, there is no free press because that's bourgeois and selfish. All of these images, look at the power of our communist revolution. Look at this coal, look at the proud working man, look at these modern factories producing for Russia, for Soviet. No, not for Russia, for the working people of Russia. Socialist realism, all art, all writing, all poetry, all film, all sculpture must benefit the revolution. You don't paint to express yourself. That's selfish. You're using resources to deal with yourself. That's not what we're about. All art must encourage the revolution. So a lot of these things have Papa Joe Stalin holding the child with the communist flag, steering the ship of the CCCP. That's the Cyrillic alphabet for USSR or Soviet Union. This modern factory, clean and pure, and all of these things. All art had to be state approved, all films, etc. And again, the glory of this revolution mechanized, collectivized agriculture, massive amounts of wheat to feed the people. You see a woman in the middle? Yeah, absolutely. The Russian Revolution called for, didn't practice, but called for gender equality. These may not look like modern tractors to you. For the early 1920s, they are very modern tractors, and Russia had never seen anything like it. But there is this, and particularly in the Ukraine. I mean, technically, this is not a Russian system, but the Russians obviously prioritize themselves. You see people starving in the Ukraine literally by the millions. Now, these images were not being publicized in Russia. Absolutely not. You couldn't print this, you would get a bullet in the head. And there are stories. People in the West say, you know what? For all of what Stalin says, he's murdering people in the Ukraine. These stories are getting out. And honestly, a lot of people on the political left in the United States and in Western Europe say, oh, well, that's propaganda. I mean, I'm sure there are problems. It's a poor country, but this would be the czarists and the conservatives and the capitalists inflating this. It wasn't inflated. Again, probably 5 million Ukrainians starved to death, and the evidence is out there, and you see some of these horrifying photographs of what starvation does to people. And Stalin was well aware of this. He didn't trust the Ukrainians. They weren't really committed to the revolution. All of these people are selfish kulak, peasant landowners, etc. And he was pretty indifferent to their suffering. So here's the key. During the Great Depression, as I mentioned, I mean, the US and Western European economies are tanking. There's nothing happening. And Russian iron and steel production triples. Unemployment, not a problem. In theory, all Soviet citizens are completely equal, regardless of ethnic background, regardless of their sex, etc. That's the story. In reality, there was no particular equality. You saw how the Ukrainians were treated. Certainly, people in the party hierarchy had privileges that no one else did. The famines are horrific. And then there's the repression, the purges. Um, Stalin was a deeply paranoid, savage person. His idea was, I keep power regardless. And he was always on the lookout for enemies of his that would weaken his power. They call this the Great Terror, great as in massive, not as in super awesome, of course. 1934 to 38. Stalin basically, through the KGB is his secret police that goes out and tries to identify all possible real and imagined enemies to Stalin. Well, some 3.5 million people are put on trial. And you know what? 99.99% are convicted as accused. Why? Because if the Soviet government is accusing you, there's a reason for it. The trials are a formality, to be sure. 750,000 of these people, the estimate, are executed directly. And you know what? Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions more, they're sent off to these freezing gulags, these prison camps in Siberia, and hundreds of thousands more, we don't even know, die in those gulags. So it's a mass extermination of his own people. Stalin decides to make this public. He uses film because people go to the films to watch these things. And in 1936, a series of 16 older men are put on public trial. These were all heroes of the November Revolution of 1917. To Russians, they are great heroes because they brought the revolution. To Stalin, they are a potential threat. And one after one, these aging men get before the cameras, and in tears they say, I must confess, I have betrayed Stalin, I have betrayed the revolution, death is too good for me, I apologize, all must follow Papa Joe Stalin, he is our father, he is our leader, please send me to my death so I can get rid of the guilt that I feel. Now, very strange that all of these people are confessing like this. You're not naive. I think you understand that they are under tremendous threat, that behind the scenes there were machine guns behind them, that their families would be wiped out if they didn't do this. They are all executed eventually for their crimes against the people. Again, these are the Stalinist purges, and they are bloody, bloody, bloody. And I believe this is our last slide. And you might notice here, we see Lenin standing in the middle with that cute little hat on, the guy with the goatee right in the center. And I believe that is Trotsky. He was one of the other early communist leaders and a great enemy of Stalin. Stalin later has him executed. He goes off to Mexico when he's forced to leave the Soviet Union, and Stalin sends an assassin after him. And Trotsky is actually stabbed to death. He's hit in the head with an ice pick, which is pretty unpleasant, about 1943 or so. So here's this photograph of Lenin with his comrade Trotsky. What do you notice below? Same photograph. Yeah, Trotsky's gone. And again, that ability, those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. Lenin never knew Trotsky. He never approved of Trotsky. He was never seen with Trotsky. Lenin supported Stalin and not Trotsky. That's what the historical record now says. Right, this went 10 minutes longer than I thought, but hey, it's all gold, right? Take some notes, come with questions. We'll talk about the Russian Revolution.